if you look at what the true barrier is of why people haven't actively invested in the stock market, it's a psychological barrier of feeling that the stock market is not for you. It's very easy to build social features. It's fucking hard to build community. We're very aware that as a company run by two white dudes, it's important that the company reflects the diversity of the community. The community, it's 40% women, it's 45% people of color.
Building community on the internet and in a pandemic is brutally tough. Today, I spoke with Leif, the co-CEO of Public, to figure out how they reached 1 million members in just 18 months and earned a valuation of $1.2 billion. One of my favorite things about Public is that you can follow great investors who do not have a pedigree from Wall Street. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So with that, let's get into it. Leif, welcome to Wine the Valley.
Nice. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. I've been very excited for this day. And I want to definitely thank Stephen Clemens, who's our Chief Creative Officer and who connected me to you. So I absolutely love, Leif, what you have done at public.com, which is all about changing investor behavior, from short-term to long-term investing. So I am just going to dive right in. So how did the idea of Public come about? Before, I believe you launched in September of 2019. Before that, how did you come up with this idea? Because, the idea of Public is definitely rooted in finance, and your background was so much design first.
Yeah. So first, I was an investor in Public before I even joined. And so I kind of, basically, you can call it like a late co-founder, so to say. So my buddy Yannick and I know each other for a long time. Yannick is Danish, by the way. I'm German. It's where the beautiful accent comes from, FYI. And so I used to work at this incubator called Prehype. Henrik was in the board of Tradable, which is the, Yannick's old company, which was like a B2B trading platform. And that's kind of how we knew each other. And so Yannick was in fintech basically his entire life. And so he really, basically was the first one who really, kind of sparked what is now called Public and known as Public. And I kind of joined him then, a few months in, so to say, after my earnout was up. I was still in my earnout at Fiverr when I sold from the Endco. And so I was, still there in my earnout and kind of, trying to have that ship kind of sail on its own. And then once I was up, I basically joined Jan to run what's now called Public. Yeah, and then in September we launched it. And the insight behind it is really this: if you look at what the true barrier is of why people haven't actively invested in the stock market, it's not really commissions. It's not really that it hasn't been pretty on a mobile app or whatever. It's a psychological barrier of feeling that the stock market is not for you. And a big piece of that is financial literacy. It's just, financial literacy is not necessarily taught in school in most cases, right? It's, you kind of either stumble into it or you have maybe, a parent who kind of teaches you. But generally speaking, for most people, it seems kind of intimidating. And we believe that intimidation comes from, because if you think about investing in the stock market, you only always have kind of two options in front of you. You either go full on day trader, you get your E-Trade account, your Robinhood, you get your margin and your options trading. But that is also, most cases, fairly short-term thinking. It's more speculative. And the goal here is often the sense of how can I make some money quickly? Then on the other hand, you had this if you're an investor, you're a passive investor, right? You just buy an ETF and let it sit.
Yeah.
But when you do that and you just put your money into a Vanguard and you let it sit, it's you don't learn anything necessarily. So you're not necessarily building your financial literacy. You're not necessarily making yourself more comfortable with these decisions or necessarily even understand how these things work. And where we really saw this opportunity is really in the middle of that, where you're actively engaged around your portfolio, but not because you're day trading and you're trading all the time, but because you're engaged around your portfolio and news stories around it and where these companies are going and investing principles, and the community is just basically enabling that in kind of a beautiful way. We always say that there's no editorial department on this planet that has the capacity to cover the vastness and the depth of the stock market. It's just not possible.
Yeah.
And the other piece is, if you're purely coming at it from an editorial angle, you will always create content a certain way, which is the way of how your editorial team will do it in that style. And if it might be long form or not or whatever, but it's like one style basically. And so what we've really seen is that the community is basically a way to truly scale education around the stock market. It's the only thing that has the capacity or even the possibility to truly cover the vastness and the depth of information around the stock market. And the other piece is you see a lot of people out there who would never look at themselves as stock market commentators, but they have very strong opinions about certain companies or certain sectors or certain industries, maybe because they've been working in the industry for a long time or, also. And so if you are interested in the future of fitness, you don't only want to talk to that financial analyst who has covered Peloton's last earnings report. You might want to talk to a former Peloton instructor. You want to talk to a bunch of people who are super psyched about Peloton and are deep in that community and so on. And the social network is truly what kind of enables that exchange and enables to bring this like vastness and these like diverse voices together. Because at the end of the day, to make an investment decision, it's not just about the financials often. It's about where's the world going. It's about certain domain expertise. It's about who's actually using this, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at what the research process for a hedge fund often looks like before they like make a certain trade, is that they will talk to customers and so on. And within something like public and in that type of community, you have actually the opportunity to make those connections and to have these more diverse voices, let's say, come together.
So when you launched in September of 2019, what did the first version of Public look like? Was that an app?
It's very similar to, it's very, very similar to what it is today, to be very honest. So we did launch in 19. We launched in 19. We came out of the gate with real-time fractional investing. And so we were actually the first ones to enable that. And so we always say we're the first brokerage that's born fractional, which then also means that from the get-go, things like dollar cost averaging, which is a investment strategy that you kind of need some money for back in the day to truly execute on, because if you want a dollar cost average your way into Amazon, which is now a $3,000 stock, you need some money to do that because you will basically have to save up, a few grand to even buy a share. And so it becomes hard. But what fractional really enabled is that, these types of investing strategies are possible for everyone to do. And so DCA is actually one of the most used captions now on the app, which stands for dollar cost averaging. And that is, for example, something that people learn as being part of the community. They learn about that this exists as a strategy and learn about, what the thinking behind it is and so on. So the first version was the real-time fractional investing, and then basically a social feed where you can follow people and follow their trades. And in the beginning, it was very heavily trade focused. And then it kind of shifted from being so focused around trades and really much more about content and opinions and insights that people have and they can share. You can still share a trade, and there's obviously a big component of it. But you see on the app right now really that, a lot of the most in-depth content is really just general content that people put together and share.
Mm-hmm. So the idea of launching a trading platform and the community together, right? I mean, launching one itself is a very big challenge. How did you decide to kind of combine both of them together?
We often say that we're basically running two products, and even the product team is basically split into social and investing. And it's very true. It's also very different talent, right? So if you look at investing talent, you really look at like some deep knowledge you kind of need there to truly build that. It's like these are trading systems are incredibly complex systems. And I think people underestimate what it takes to build and run and scale a trading system. It's very, very different. Like my old company was like a SaaS tool, and I felt that was complex because it had so many features and whatnot. It's an effing joke against what we're building right now. The trading system itself is crazy, crazy, crazy complex and crazy hard to build and scale. And then on top of that, you have the social layer, where you're going into a bunch of other components like graph databases, algorithms on trending feeds, and all that kind of stuff, which is very, very hard and complex in its own right. Yeah. And so you really have these kind of two products, so to say, that we've merged together that are very unique challenges on its own, but they also were very unique own talent sets. And so people who are very deep in investing might not necessarily be very deep in the social side and vice versa.
So I believe today you have a little over 1 million users, members, right? What were some of the things where you felt the community is coming together, right? Building a community, you have to hit a certain tipping point. Otherwise, if people are not engaged, They just signed up. That's not how you build a community. So what were the things where you felt, okay, this community is coming together, there's recurring engagement, people are passionate, how did you do that?
It's very easy to build social features. It's fucking hard to build community. And what we've done very early on was a sense of understanding of who we're building for, and therefore trying to mold the community early on. And so as a stock trading app, normally what people would likely think is like the most low-hanging fruit is like go to StockTwits and Co. and just like try to acquire all these stock traders because they must like the app, right? They want to talk about already, they're already social, let's do that. But if we would have done that, we would have just replicated the same type of culture of a community within public. And it would have, from my perspective, never had the chance to be a true mass consumer product. Because, you would apply the trader culture versus building the investing culture, which didn't exist in the community before. And so instead of doing that and going after this, what people would, I think, normally expect to be the low-hanging fruits, we went after creative communities, for example. We went after female leadership communities. We brought in Sophia Moroso and worked with Girl Boss, things like that, to make sure that the first people we bring onto the app represent the type of user that we've planned to build this product for. In the end, you become who you acquire. And so very early on, I think it's super important to be very mindful of who you acquire. To not just go out and think of where can I acquire the low-hanging fruits and as easy as possible user will use this, but being very mindful of what is the product and the company you're truly building, what is the vision you have here, and then acquire the people that you believe are the right fit for that, for what you're building. And especially when you build a community, that becomes obviously even more present and important because it's the actual culture that you will create, and it's going to be very hard for you to change that later on. And so for us, because we want to try to build a mass consumer company, it's important that as you come into the app, you feel it's for you. And you recognize that here are people there that, are like me, or people that have the same interests, people that look like me, people that, I want to learn from, that the community itself from a vibe perspective is something that, has the ability to be something, mainstream, and therefore something that's welcoming of people who are new to investing. And so that's really what the main kind of first focus was.
And the first, let's say, 10,000 users, right? How did you acquire that? I mean, that is very, very tough.
Yeah, it was very, very much community partnerships. So if you think about it as like two phases that you're going through, especially as a social app like ours, is that in the early days, I think you want to acquire for network density. So you want to acquire people that already have a certain relation to each other. That can be because they know each other in person. That can mean because they are in the same circles, because they have the same, kind of interests. But you basically want to, in the beginning, you want to have this moment where you're focusing on a very specific circle. So when you acquire people with high network density, they come onto the app and there's an instant connection with the other users on the app. That creates, just activation and engagement and whatnot. But it also helps to focus the culture in early on, and it helps to kind of be in control over that a little bit, because you can kind of predict what people will talk about and, who will connect with whom and things like that. As you grow, I think you shift from trying to acquire with network density to basically trying to acquire really way more mainstream, and therefore you will also end up acquiring a lot of people who have zero network density when they come into the product. They will have not a single person on the app. And then you will end up really, being more reliant on, algorithms, so to say, and it will be much more like a TikTok, right? When I sign up for TikTok, it's the feed that learns what I like, that will show me the content that, it's believed is relevant for me. And that's how I discover people to follow and whatnot, not because of network density, but it's because of more interest, and behavior that kind of drives that. And so I think you have these kind of two phases that you go into. And so early on for community building, I think that focusing on network density is very important. Also for word of mouth reasons, right? It's way easier to get kind of breaking point for word of mouth if you focus in on a very specific group, because you can be hyped within a very small circle easier and quicker than in a large circle, right? Or in something that's not as connected. And then as you grow, you will just focus on way more kind of mainstream acquisition channels. You will have way more press and so on, which will drive way more dispersed types of users into your app. And then you kind of have to focus on how can someone with zero network density have as good of an experience in their first experience with the app as someone with a lot of network density.
So I remember watching this Warren Buffett's interview, and he said 2 reasons for his success. Number 1, born in America. and number two, compounding. And I looked at like, what does compounding mean? And over the years, it has just amazed me. So I did some calculation a few years ago where if you save $20,000 a year, it just like, let's say, S&P 500 rate of return, let's say, close to 10% or so, including the dividends. And you go on for 40 years, saving 20 grand every year and, adding 10% rate of return on an average, you end up with more than $10 million. I was like blown away by this math, right? Like $10 million is a massive amount of money, and you don't even have to do anything extraordinary. It's about discipline, and it's a lot about, making sure you stay the course. So I want to understand more from you, right? Like, how do you look at the difference between short-term trading and long-term investing?
So first off, I think learning about investing and investing principles and how the stock market works has a lot of interesting side effects. So when you learn about the example that you're making, and you just learn about like the power of compounding, and and therefore just like it will also help you to understand how interest works. You will suddenly have a different view on your credit card. You have a different view on a mortgage. You will suddenly, if you understand how the stock market works and how companies behave because of it, you will understand incentives in generally, different industries and why a company did a layoff even though they are profitable and stuff like that. You will understand incentives in politics and so on. And so I think just generally learning about investing in the stock market just has a lot of positive side effects for people's general financial literacy. And I think if you're a member of a society, so to say, where the stock market is such a massive, important piece of it, I think it's important that more people understand it, because again, it's impacting policies, it's impacting how companies behave, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that is just general like baseline, I think, of why it's just good to participate and just start to learn. And then the next step after that, I think, then goes into wealth creation. But I think the cold hard truth is that most people in America are far away from wealth creation, right? They live paycheck to paycheck. And so with that, I think it's number one, really the building of financial literacy and participating and therefore learning. And then as you might go from paycheck to paycheck into having some money left over at the end of the month and so on. I think it helps to have that baseline knowledge to then make smarter decisions what to do with that, moving forward. I think the cold truth is most people don't have 20 grand to put away every year. Mm-hmm. I think generally getting more people participating, I think is, just a good thing for financial literacy in the first place. And then wealth creation is really kind of like a secondary effect that happens after that. But I think it starts with just participating as like a forcing function to build a literacy.
Yeah. Kind of switching gears a little bit, because I am just so impressed by the culture you've built at Public, right? And I remember like getting exposed to Public when you brought on Ryan Leslie, on your platform. So I worked very closely with Ryan on his startup, Superphone. And I mean, I'm a big fan of his music. What is the strategy behind getting these artists and, all these celebrities, right, on Public? Why are you doing that?
So we think a massive piece to get more people engaged in the stock market is to make the stock market more approachable. And one of the pieces to make it more approachable is to show people that are actually active in the stock market that you wouldn't expect necessarily around the stock market. I think right now, when you think about the stock market and people are active in it, you will think about Jim Cramer and you think about CNBC and you will think about, Tony Robbins' book and da-da-da-da-da-da. And you basically will end up with these kind of like guru types and so on. And I think what happens if just focus on these kind of guru types is that it's not really that approachable in the end, because it's basically people telling you how to do something. It doesn't mean that you really know how to do it and that you understand it. Mm-hmm. And one way to make it more approachable is to experience the stock market with people who have gone through the same thing that you're going through, who are the same level as you are. And so it's much more, not just having a personal trainer, but you also want to have a gym buddy. Mm-hmm. And I think that gym buddy is often way more important than a personal trainer. And so just by, bringing some people on the stock market, you wouldn't necessarily expect around it, but you kind of know of and whatnot, and learning about their stories, and reading about how they got into investing and so on. Just one way to break down some of the psychological barriers around participating in the first place.
And one thing I've realized is, especially my learning from last year, was investing is so much a game of stomach than brain. It's like, I remember my investments, which I made in, like, this was last week of March of last year and April. I mean, those were the toughest, because the market was like sliding almost on a daily basis. And like, you don't know where the bottom is. And your stomach is churning. You've put so much money in it. And now I look back, those were the best investments, right? Like, from rate of return. And so what do you suggest? Like, how do a person, who's just getting exposed to stock market build those muscles? Because it is just so scary. It's very easy. Once you see S&P 500 slide 38%, you're so panicked that you want to sell. I mean, that's your like immediate reaction.
One thing that helps in public is that you have the community, and you're not alone with your charts and your numbers. If you purely look at the chart that's pointing down 30%, that will scare you very quickly. You're just going to hit the sell button. And depending if you need the money or not, obviously, there might be good reasons why you hit the sell button, right? So everyone's personal situations look like. But what the community really does is that once these things happen, they're immediately trending topics on the app. And you immediately have a long comment thread of what's going on and so on. And that context helps people to kind of digest the situation before they take action. And so I think that's it's a thing of like, we're in it together. And that is, I think, a very kind of powerful and helpful, in a sense, kind of mechanism there. And then I think with that, some people always talk about buying the dip, which you could argue is maybe an investment strategy to some extent. And I think these are all these types of, things that people learn about if they're part of the community. We learn about dollar cost averaging. We learn about someone who's always posting buying the dip, right? And like what these things mean and why people think about it that way. And so I think just that context in play is what's actually so helpful, because you're not just alone with your charts and numbers.
Yeah. Switching gears to the culture of the public team, I would love to know how you've designed the team over the years, right? I know that you have a very big focus on diversity, inclusion, and how have you designed the team over the years like that?
I do think it's obviously crazy important. We had a very high focus on culture in the very beginning. And that comes from, number one, being very clear on what's the company we're trying to build. And the culture that comes with it that we're trying to build is just going to be a representation of whatever the companies we're trying to build. I often make like the other extreme example where it's, if you talk about like what is a good culture, it's basically just people's opinions. Because a good culture for something that is, you have a super sales-driven team that we would churn through employees every 6 months. It's super hectic. People work 20 hours a day, and people would say like, this is a toxic culture. But for this company, it might work, right? They might be a super successful company, and it's, it's just part of their structure. And so I think it's like culture, and what makes a good culture is very much a question of, whoever of what you're trying to build as a company, right? And so for us, there were a few things. Number one, we tend to look at ourselves of trying to build a high output organization. And I would make the argument that we're, I think, fairly known for just the output that we're having in terms of new features, in terms of, things we're doing on the marketing side, et cetera, et cetera. We're in a fairly small team so far. And I feel like what we've, just put out in the world, I think is kind of incredible considering, the size of the company and the time frame we've done it into. And with that, I think comes just a sense of trying to build something that has a high efficiency in operation. That high efficiency comes from having a very clear sense of autonomy and alignment. And so where, autonomy without alignment is anarchy. And so in terms of aligning people, really the sense of clear goals and whatnot, but then also having very clear principles in organization that help people make decisions the way the org intends them to make decisions, but they're able to make them autonomously. And that really then just creating, an environment where just a lot of things can happen very quickly. And therefore you end up having a very high efficient, high outcome kind of culture. And so we focus very early on also just actually to define very clear our principles that we operate under. I think it's easy to be kind of cynical about these things and look at them as like motivational cat posters in an office or something, but we really look at them as tools. And so, principle one, for example, is honesty equals bullshit, which is again a mechanism of efficiency, right? You want to keep ambiguity out of the way. You want to keep gossip out of the way. You want to create good relationships quickly. And so if you're just honest and frank with someone, you will also have a better relationship faster than if you're trying to talk around the bush all the time, And so, within the organization, principle one is, for example, just a phrase that is being used all the time. And then by taking basically principle one and saying it out loud in context, it gives people the license to operate with honesty equals bullshit, even if it doesn't come necessarily natural to them or they're necessarily comfortable with it normally because it might be new to the org or whatever. But it's kind of like the license you give to people to operate that way. And so you hear principle one all the time in the organization. It's like, hey, principle one, dum, 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 dum. And then someone's not trying to be a dick or whatever. They're just, operating, on the kind of like sense of efficiency and clarity that, this frankness kind of provides. And by someone speaking it out loud, also the other person receiving that feedback knows in this moment, like, hey, this is purely based off the cultural principles, and therefore it's a mechanism of efficiency again, which at the end of the day helps us build a high output organization. And this is like one example, right? And so I think these types of principles and like using them as tools, I think is a very powerful thing to just build that. In terms of D&I, we can always do better, no question. I think one thing for us is that we're very aware that as a company run by two white dudes. That's number one. And so, we have to over-exceed on this even more than maybe others. Number two is it's important that the company reflects the diversity of the community. And give an example, in the community, it's 40% women, it's 45% people of color. Within the company now in the US, we are 45% female, roughly 40% POC. And so I think we made some progress, but we're, for example, not purely aligned on that yet in terms of alignment between community. And if you're building for someone, especially in a consumer brand and so on, I think it's important that you're trying to, have an alignment between your team and the people you're actually building something for.
Yeah. So about the future, right? Like I would say Public is the company which was pretty much formed in the pandemic to a large extent, right? And when you are socially distancing and you're so early in the company formation, and when you're remote, like how are you hiring fast? And when you are going through so much emotion, in a short span of time, and when you're not in front of each other, right? It's not just about like putting out work out there. It's about connecting emotionally as well. So how have you done it?
It's funny. Historically, we had these moments of front-loading hires a lot. We had these little sprints of adding a lot of people to the organization, hiring, slowing down, executing, and adding a lot of people to the organization. So an example, we pretty much, like we close to doubled the company since basically year to date. But then we had a few months before that where we didn't necessarily hire that quickly. And I think it's these little sprints of kind of going in and out of like also finding your groove in the new ensemble again, right? Once you add so many people. I think the other piece is, again, this very clear principles, beating the drum on these things again and again and again. We've gotten to the groove now to have like a very good onboarding, like a decent onboarding flow. I shouldn't be the judge on that. Other people should, but hopefully a good, maybe reasonably working well onboarding flow of just new employees and whatnot. Where it's just certain sessions that all that like team leads have that people are coming to the org. The very first one is like happening on the Monday at 9 a.m. where it's basically Yannick and myself literally just running through how we like to work, how we talk about the company, what's the goal, all the principles, and so on, to just really kind of create this kind of like first just cultural introduction. I think if you grow very quickly, it's also important that specifically on a management level, like anyone who kind of manages people has a very clear alignment on principles and how the company should operate. Because if not, you will end up building a patchwork culture because people will just default to how they did it at the old company. And not saying that it's always bad. I'm sure, there's always, good nuggets that new people add to the org, of course. But I think you want to be mindful of not suddenly creating a bunch of little subcultures which will lead to every team being vastly different and having very different vibe and very different way of how they operate and ending up using different terminologies for things and all that kind of stuff. And so again, it falls back to autonomy through alignment, is that yes, you want people to autonomously execute as much as possible, but in order to do that, you have to effing focus on alignment all the time. There's this German word called Einrenken, which is like when you go to the chiropractor and they kind of like put your spine in order to kind of, get you going again. And so Einrenken is we're using the word now all the time internally as like basically having quick ad hoc sessions to align with someone. And when you recognize that you're, discussing something to death and you recognize that you're not really aligned on something because you can have different opinions, but if you're going after the same goal and we're all smart people, we should end up at pretty much similar, conclusions. And so if we're not, let's have an Einrenken. Let's figure out what's the why it's not working out right now. Let's get to the core of that. And those are obviously, for example, also some of the most hardest and painful sessions. But I think by having the tool of hey, there's an Einrenken, there's a special kind of moment in time of where you're trying to, achieve that, I think gives people kind of the space to go through that pain. Because it's not easy if you go through that. It's not easy to go through that, and it will need a lot of principle one to really, kind of crank through.
And how are you thinking about reopening offices going forward? Clearly, it feels like pandemic will be in the rearview mirror very soon. So how are you thinking about opening offices? What's the...
Yep. So generally, we made the decision early on in the pandemic where we said we are operating with optimism for the future, which means that we did not change our strategy because of the pandemic. And therefore, yes, we will go back to an office at some point. And yes, we will have offices. Then as a second step to that, we think in hubs. And so a hub is basically a physical location, so to say, where you have multiple employees and a hub can turn into an office. And so for us, currently, that means we have New York as a headquarter, we have Copenhagen as another office, we have Raleigh, North Carolina, which is currently a hub, going to turn into an office very soon. And then we have a few people in California, for example, now that we also hired throughout the pandemic and so on. And depending on how that grows, that hub might turn into an office at some point. But that's kind of how we think about it. And so throughout the pandemic, we hired more people that are remote. And I think it's, and we're going to see, we're going to give people the freedom to kind of, decide when they want to eventually move to New York or move to another hub, another office or so on, things like that. But generally, we want to try to have people together in offices at some point again.
Cool. So we have come to the last section of our podcast, Leif. We call it Sprint. It means that I'll give you two options. You have to pick one. There's no right or wrong answer. What comes to your mind first, you should pick that one.
That'd be horrible. Okay.
I'll start with the easy one. I'll start with the easy one for you. New York or San Francisco?
New York, 1,000%.
Yeah. People or process?
Both.
Oh man, that's not an option. That's why it is hard.
Yeah, but that's not really a comparison. How do you compare that? I mean, generally, I would say then process because I'm all for efficiency. So I'd rather do a good process and just hire more people.
All right. Okay. Experiment or research?
Experiment.
Bitcoin or Dogecoin?
Bitcoin.
Apple or Google?
Apple.
Musk or Bezos?
Bezos.
This one amazes me. Almost everyone has picked Bezos, where I was even myself, I would pick Bezos over Musk as well, but it just amazes me. So
Musk is incredible, right? Let's be honest. I mean, that guy is truly the, real life Tony Stark.
Yeah.
And just the balls he has to go after the most incredibly hard problems is amazing. But as a business person, man, growing your company, what is it, average 20% year over year or something, or even more than that, most cases, for what now, 20 years or whatever, how old Amazon is?
Yeah.
That's effing baller, right? I mean, that's execution.
I mean, I have not seen anyone execute so fast at this scale.
Yeah.
And once they set their eyes on something, they are going, so absolutely. I totally agree with you. I think that's pretty much it, Leif. I absolutely enjoyed it.
Awesome.
Thank you. And Leif, after I am done with my vaccination, New York will be probably my first flying destination. So
Of course.
thank you, Leif.
Cool.
I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Awesome. See ya.
Thanks for tuning in and listening. You can find Why in the Valley wherever you get your podcasts, available now on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more.